Okay, so here with us today, we've got one of our Newcastle United writers and also pod on the Tyne regular Chris Waugh with us, as well as lead writer for the Athletic FC newsletter, Phil Hay as well. Gents, good to have you with us. Chris, let's start with you because I guess it's been hardly a peaceful summer at Newcastle United. PSR black holes, changing ownership, and also let's not forget Eddie Howe was linked with the England job as well. But on the eve of the Premier League starting, do we have some clarity at St James's Park right now?
Clarity of sorts, I suppose, is the best way of responding to that. I mean, it has been a very, very busy summer, and when Newcastle fans arrive at St James's Park on Saturday, there's going to be Adidas has returned as the kit sponsor. The font above the East Stand, which shows Newcastle United, is no longer in the font that was there under Mike Ashley. It's back to the sort of retro font. There's going to be a new fan zone. And yet, actually, on the pitch, nothing will have changed. Newcastle have made 5 signings this summer, if you include making Lewis Hall permanent. But they haven't. They're not actually going to have a fresh face in the starting 11 by all accounts, really. But they've had PSR issues where they very, very nearly were going to get They feared a sort of double-digit points deduction because they were so far above the breach. Then Amanda Staveley and Amanda Ghodouss, the co-owners who have been basically the face of the club post takeover, have left, and there's been a complete restructuring at the top. So now Darren Eales, the CEO, is very much in charge, but there's a new sporting director in Paul Mitchell, and he's come in and very much tried to assert his authority to a certain degree. And then we've had Eddie Howe sort of left feeling a little bit uncomfortable as to everything that's going on around. There's a performance director, which is a new position Newcastle didn't have before, in James Bunce, who's someone who's looking at training, look at the intensity of training. Those relationships and boundaries, as Eddie Howe has spoken about, are starting to be worked through. But as things stand going on the eve of this season, I wouldn't say that everything is calm and that Newcastle can fully focus on the remainder of the campaign, because I think further changes could still come along the
Yeah,
way.
don't worry, Newcastle fans. You've got a beautiful away kit to think about if everything all goes wrong all season. It's gorgeous. I got to point out. But you mentioned Amanda Staveley there, and also Madad Ghodouss as well, leaving. Was that something that shocked you? Were you surprised by that?
I was surprised in the sense that how it and when it came about. And I mean, Amanda Staveley, who did an interview with George Culkin, our colleague, it admitted basically it was not part of the plan that they were initially going to leave this summer. And Newcastle, it was sort of unique when they were taken over, in the sense that previously under Mike Ashley, Newcastle didn't have an executive structure of any real description. Lee Charnley was the managing director, and that was about it. That was all. They didn't have a sporting director. They didn't have a CEO. They didn't have a chief operating officer, chief commercial officer that they've got now. And so when the takeover first happened, Amanda Staveley and Mia Ghodouss sort of did a bit of everything. They were doing stuff on the footballing side, on the business side. And I think inevitably over time, as that structure's come into place, it's almost been that there's those sort of competing forces, that rather than just a sort of silent investor, as maybe they were suggested Staveley and Ghodouss could move to
Mm.
be, they still wanted to be active, and basically would almost be stepping on other people's toes. And so the decision was made that for the betterment maybe of the club, and for the way that they can professionalize further going forward, was that maybe they had to step away and the structures in place. We will see in time whether that does work out. It feels already that it is very much Darren Eales' club now, and that he is
Mm.
very much front and centre, whereas he wasn't previously. And that also with it brings pressure and the need to deliver.
Staveley and Ghodouss moving on as a club looks to move on itself. From a neutral perspective, you're looking at this thinking, I mean, that's a likely thing to happen, right? It's not uncommon as clubs change personnel and look for new commercial entities and stuff, that people also do move on. But did this one surprise you?
It did surprise me, but it makes sense to me if they don't feel that they can hover in the background with no great influence. You find these days that the structure of staff at big clubs is vast. And Chris touched on it there. At Newcastle under Mike Ashley, there was a complete vacuum of people in
Mm.
positions that you would expect to be filled at a club like Newcastle. Um, so it follows a logical process that as Newcastle get bigger and try to become more professional, you see people like Paul Mitchell coming in, because there aren't many clubs of that size that operate without some form of sporting director, technical director, director of football. I totally get that, and I think if the kind of Staveley axis don't feel that they can be almost like silent partners in this, then and I guess if they're worried that they might start to tread on people's toes, then it's got to be the right thing to do to have a clean break and to leave other people to get on with it. But at the same time, Staveley in particular has been so closely associated with Newcastle since that takeover. I got the sense that it was difficult for people to get their heads around, and certainly I didn't seem to feel like it was signposted much. I didn't see that coming. I didn't expect it, and it was a little bit of a bolt from the blue. But I think all things considered, as Newcastle try and move to a position where they've got deeper departments and bigger, more effective departments, people in authority right the way across the club, you don't really need two people as senior as that calling the shots and being so involved.
Chris, what does this mean for Eddie Howe? You touched on it earlier, and there's a beautiful piece by George Corkin as well, who speaks about, this sort of period of intimacy that Newcastle had. You've got Staveley, you've also got Ghodouss, you've got Eddie Howe. They're all sort of like together, putting this sort of DIY kind of hierarchy together. Now, Eddie Howe doesn't have that. He doesn't have his allies in the club. What does this mean for him as manager?
Well, use the term manager, and this has been a bit of an issue, I suppose, at Newcastle recently. Where they did have head coaches. Then when Rafa Benitez came in, it was very clear that he was manager. And Eddie Howe has been nominally head coach. That's a position he's been given, but really partly out of necessity, given when he was appointed in November 2021, when Newcastle was staring relegation in the face, really, and they didn't have this executive structure yet. He assumed greater responsibility. There was almost, in the very first transfer window post takeover, he was almost sort of like a de facto sporting director of his own accord as well, in terms of the authority he had. And he's never really fully ceased that. And it was made very clear by a few weeks ago by Darren Eales, the CEO, where he basically referred to Eddie Howe as the head coach. And he said, we want to sort of lessen the responsibilities he has elsewhere so he can do what he is best at, and that's coaching on the sort of training field. And it was later in the week that we then spoke to Eddie Howe out in Germany, and he shot back a little bit at that and sort of was basically saying he spoke about boundaries, and he spoke about having to be happy in his role. And he certainly, there is a void with Amanda Staveley and Amanda Staveley leaving, because I think, unlike maybe some ownership level structures you would have elsewhere, they were very, very active in terms of communication with the head coach and with other people at the club. That layer is gone, and Newcastle already feels a bit more, for want of a better term, corporate. And that is, to an extent, inevitable as a club grows and as they try to become a quote-unquote super club. You see it at others, and I'm sure it's very much the same at the very biggest clubs in the world. But for now, it feels like Newcastle have fast-forwarded from one period into another at a very short period of time, and Eddie Howe is still trying to get his head around that and grasp that. And he certainly feels less secure in his position than he did 3 months ago. That's not to suggest that he thinks he's going to be sacked or anything imminently, but at the same time, he's not Paul Mitchell's man. Usually the way that things work is a sporting director appoints the head coach. That hasn't happened here. The sporting director has brought in a performance director. How does that influence what happens with Eddie Howe as well? And also, transfer-wise, he seems to have lost at least some authority in the short term. He talked about wanting collaboration on that. And so for now, I think that he is still trying to figure out exactly what this means for him, both now and going forward.
I think with Howe, if he sees himself staying at the top of the game in club football or going on to a bigger job further down the line, then he's going to have to get used to this. I mean, at clubs of that size, you do have technical boards around you at all levels. And I think Arne Slot and Liverpool are a really good example of that at the moment. I read one of George Colkin's pieces about the changes and Staveley departing and everything else. And Chris will know that if you write about football for any length of time, you'll sit and listen to managers say an awful lot of things. And you'll sit and listen to them say an awful lot of nothing an awful lot of the time. They get asked what they're supposed to get asked. They say what you expect them to say, and that's it. But digging into the quotes from Howe, they felt different, really. The lines where he was saying quite openly, look, if the dynamic doesn't work for me here, I won't be here. He was trying to caveat that by saying, I'm okay with this. I'm quite happy. But in my experiences, coaches don't say things like that unless actually there's a little niggle in their head or they kind of want to make that point clear. Something I'd ask you, Chris, I get the sense that Paul Mitchell kind of arrived without Eddie Howe having much involvement in that at all, and not necessarily totally knowing that it was going to happen. Why would that be the case, given that Howe is so involved and so prominent, and you would think so important there? And how much of an issue is it?
It's true that, I mean, not very many people at all knew that Paul Mitchell was coming in. It took a lot of people by surprise, including those at the club, and Howe didn't get that much of pre-warning that Paul Mitchell was arriving. Newcastle had gone on a sort of exhaustive search for a sporting director, and in, I think it was May, June, had actually approached Crystal Palace's sporting director, Dougie Freedman, and didn't get him in the end. And so that they almost went back to the drawing board. Paul Mitchell had been in the process early on, and seemingly early on had ruled himself out. And this is reading between the lines, but I think part of the reason why he had ruled himself out was maybe that level of authority he would have, and would he get the authority he'd necessarily want to come in? And I think maybe concessions were made, and that again encroaches potentially on Eddie Howe and what his exact position is. I think you're right that if Howe is thinking about in the future being another sort of sizable club, that he has to get used to these sort of restrictions. I suppose it's always very difficult to retrofit that. If he came into the club and those things are already there and he hasn't had that level of authority previously, it's probably easier to get on with it. But if you haven't had if you have had the responsibility, if you have had the ability to mainly be the vocal voice on transfers, and then that disappears or certainly gets diluted, I think that is an issue. Now, out in Germany, it was very interesting because we weren't quite sure what to expect in the press conference. By we, I'm referring to the sort of local media who were out there. I'll say this now, I don't think I've told this anecdote, but we were in a small room and there weren't enough chairs, and Eddie Howe walked in and I ended up sitting, bouncing up and down on a medicine ball as he was having this very serious conversation, which I don't think went down particularly well.
Get the cardio up quickly.
Did Colkin get the gold throne?
Obviously. He
took the last seat, didn't he?
Yeah. And a lot of the questions were about the England job because Eddie Howe was being linked to that at the time, and I think we were all taken by surprise as to how strong he went on the changes at Newcastle. Partly, I think that was influenced by Darren Eales having spoken early in the week and the comments he maybe made about being on the training field, but also I think because Darren Eales has spoken very positively about Eddie Howe and wanting to build around him, I think it was almost like a public plea for, well, I need to know that you may be talking a good game, but I actually need to see action now. And immediately afterwards, there were some sort of conciliatory talks, and seemingly Howe was reassured to an extent. But we're a few weeks on, still hasn't got what he wanted necessarily in the transfer market, and those tensions are definitely still there as things move forward. And I think that Eddie Howe, as I said earlier, is definitely more insecure than he was a few months ago.
Yeah, quick one for you, Phil. And actually, Chris, do jump in on this one if you've got anything to add. Is that, I'm sort of on the outside of this thinking, there's this big takeover at Newcastle. You've got this big conglomerate that's got the money and everyone's going, they're the richest club in the world, all that kind of stuff. And then we are now seeing all these changes that are happening within the executive structure and people leaving and people coming in. But something's glaring to me is that actually for Newcastle to get to that point, that takeover was a bit of a smokescreen to actually the work that still needs to be done to get Newcastle to that point. Don't you think, Phil?
Oh, very much so. I mean, the point about football in the Premier League at the moment is that revenue is king. And revenue doesn't really mean how rich your owners are or how deep your pockets are. I know there's the constant discussion about associated sponsorship, and if your ownership can find ways to sponsor you via related parties and everything else, and kind of keep it under wraps, then it helps with the amount of money that's arriving. But because PSR at the moment is based on acceptable losses, and even the changes that are proposed and coming further down the line will relate to percentages of annual turnover, you need to have an awful lot of money coming in. This isn't the era of Abramovich at Chelsea when it was a case of we have this billionaire and he's going to spend and he's going to spend and he will spend exactly what he likes and there's nothing you can do about it. There are clear restrictions in place, and I think more to the point, the Premier League have started to show that the rules actually have teeth and they will be imposed and they will lead to sanctions which can do clubs a lot of damage. So yeah, it's I think in order for Newcastle to become a club who can contend properly with Manchester City, Arsenal and others, it's going to be on the commercial side where that happens. And you're right, there's a huge amount of work to be done still. It isn't just a case of getting into the transfer market and spending heavily, as nice as that would be.
I agree with everything that Phil said, and certainly with Newcastle, I think it's almost a moniker which, when the takeover first happened, this quote-unquote wealthiest, richest club in the world was seen as almost being sort of sexy on the outside to a certain degree, and that this would benefit them. But really, it's become a bit of a millstone around their neck, and certain people inside the club speak about that there is a disconnect. I think more not mainly with the Newcastle fan base, although with some supporters at Newcastle, but mainly in an even broader scale, that there is this idea they are the richest club in the world and they can do what they want, but that's not how it operates in practice. Newcastle don't just have access to the untold billions that the PIF, their majority owners, may have, but they can't, even if they did have access to that, they can't spend it all in the short to medium term because of the restrictions that are in place in the Premier League. So they are operating very much at the level that they are, which is to try and catch up as much as they can to the so-called Big Six and the revenues they generate. And they have been increasing sort of 33% each year, but they're still basically half those sorts of levels in terms of the very top. And that means they can't spend as much.
You're listening to the Athletic FC podcast today, discussing Newcastle and their changes over the summer. And if you have something you think we should be talking about or want to let us know what you think of the podcast and this season, you can just email us. Get in touch on tafcpod@theathletic.com. All right, let's get back to it, because joining us now as we delve into Newcastle's summer transfer business is our football correspondent, David Ornstein. David, good to have you with us. And I guess the big story is Crystal Palace's Marc Guehi. What is going on there? Have Newcastle got themselves one of the star of the Euros?
Well, it's the big pursuit of the summer transfer window, at least in the Premier League so far, by the looks of it, in terms of the actual player, the clubs involved, and the value of it. Because we're not seeing deals like we saw in the summer of 2023 when, say, Declan Rice moved for in excess of £100 million and Harry Kane left for a similar fee. So when you're talking in the 60s and potentially higher, we need to pay attention. We also need to pay attention because Marc Guehi has been an excellent performer for Crystal Palace, an upwardly mobile team in the Premier League. He's also established himself in the England team, not just the squad. And that has led Newcastle to target him as they look to strengthen their team and specifically the centre of their defence. Of course, Sven Botman has been out injured and will be for a while longer. And he plays on that left side, the same area that Marc Guehi operates in, even though Marc Guehi is right-footed. And I revealed a few weeks ago, I think it was, that Newcastle had opened negotiations with Crystal Palace. They were now in talks with them. And the attempt from Newcastle's perspective was to strike a deal within their budget, which we know is constrained, and we know the financial fair play, profitability and sustainability issues that they've encountered. But at the same time, Crystal Palace have no obligation to sell. He's under contract for 2 more years. He's into the last 24 months now. He has clearly a range of suitors because many of the biggest clubs in football have looked at him or have them on their recruitment lists. And I think they would be of the view, certainly their chairman and co-owner, Steve Parish, that if you're going to sell somebody of Marc Guehi's ilk, you should be looking at precedents set by the likes of Harry Maguire and Wesley Fofana, who are all in the region of sort of £80 million, euros, give or take. This is a different market for the reasons I've explained, and that would be beyond Newcastle's budget. So they made an initial offer that was knocked back. They made a second offer, I think, in the region of sort of £50 million. That was knocked back. And a third offer has been as well, which I think is £55 million plus £5 million in achievable add-ons, which gets them to that sort of £60 million mark, really substantial Newcastle United. But Crystal Palace have set their sights higher. There is a sense that maybe Steve Parish and his fellow owners would compromise around the £70 million mark. There have been reports that 65 will get it done. So clearly there's a discrepancy, a gap in valuations that will need to be breached if this deal is going to proceed. Now, the conversations continue, but also Newcastle United look at alternative candidates, and they will have their recruitment list, and there'll be an active discussions for at least 1 or 2 of them to see if they're going to need to move on, and if they do, which of them they would like to go for. But I don't think the door should be closed on this situation just yet. There's still time in the transfer window. The clubs clearly have some dialogue going on, and things can change at any moment. So you've seen Steve Parish go public and speak on camera about how highly he values Marc Guehi. Newcastle haven't said anything publicly, and they're trying to see whether this can progress. But it's clearly quite a delicate situation. There's no guarantee it will be done. And Crystal Palace at the same time have another situation going on that we exclusively revealed. Two bids have gone in for Joachim Andersen, Marc Guehi's central defensive partner. The first was £20 million rejected from Fulham, who of course had him on loan previously before he joined Crystal Palace permanently. The second was £25 million plus 5 in add-ons, taking it to £30 million. Palace looking more in the direction of £40 million. But he's a 28-year-old. And, if they decide to go forward with that, would that have implications for Marc Guehi? Would they still consider trading him, or would they say, no, that's us done now? Or will Marc Guehi go first and then they say no to the Andersen offers and tell him that he's staying put? Could both players be offered new contracts? Would they be interested in signing them? This is a fascinating situation, and Newcastle United, with so much at stake, their new ownership, their new sporting director, Paul Mitchell, wanting to act responsibly and prudently, needing to act within their financial restrictions, needing to progress with their project and their club, have a lot to think about.
I naively perhaps thought that when it went to 55 plus 5 for Guéhi, that would just about do it. And perhaps it will. I mean, I was following Steve Parish talking and saying that, in essence, Palace weren't remotely interested in what had been offered so far. And that might just be grandstanding. It might be like David said there, that actually there isn't much ground to cover here before they get to a deal. I think what was interesting in Parish's comments was him describing Guehi or painting him as a generational talent. And I really like him. I think he's a quality player. But do we generally feel that he is a generational talent or falls into that bracket? I guess what I'm asking is, if somebody goes to 70-80 million pounds, is he worth it?
You've got to say players are worth what somebody's prepared to pay for them. And if you look at the market, are there any other clubs in for Marc Guehi right now? It doesn't seem to be the case. If they were, where are they prepared to go, Phil? And it doesn't seem to the levels that Steve Parish would like. I think it's slightly environmental, as I mentioned, with the market at this point in time. Those higher sums don't seem to be being spent by clubs in this slightly financially restricted era we seem to be going through, where we've seen the financial rules, PSR, have teeth because teams are being punished. And so there's a bit more responsible thinking. Then to the actual player himself, inside the last 2 years of his contract, so that dictates the fee to an extent. He's not played European football. He's not played for one of the biggest clubs in England, with all due respect to Crystal Palace, who are a fantastic club. And he's just broken onto the international scene. He's not got sort of trophies to his name. He's in the earlier stages, judging by his age and his trajectory. Some people think, he lacks a tiny bit of height for that position. And I think in the past, other clubs have been looking for somebody with a bit more. Of course, Chelsea let him go at a young age, so he didn't figure in their plans. And you're right, that is something that will play into Newcastle's thinking when they're deliberating over whether and how far to push for this player. They'll be analysing the data, the metrics, the market, and Steve Parish is entitled to say what he wants. The Crystal Palace owners are entitled to set whatever price they want. But they'll also have to consider, if he stays, he'll be then approaching, at the end of this season, 12 months to go in his contract. Will the market still be there for him then? I'm sure clubs would want to sign him. But two things: at what value? And secondly, would he be interested in leaving at that point, or would he want to stay one more year until 2026 and go as a free agent? Does Steve Parish have confidence that if Marc Guehi stays, he will sign a new contract? There doesn't seem to be a sign of it right now. Would that change? So there are plenty of factors, and I sensed from the comments that Steve Parish made that Palace would entertain a deal, but it just needs to be at a price point that they're happy with, and it doesn't appear that they are yet. On your point, Phil, about whether it will get done at that 55 plus 5, no, I don't think it will. I think it will need to edge up a bit, and it's whether Newcastle are prepared to do that. And if they do, whether Palace will relent my mind does cast back to 2019 when Arsenal were trying to sign Wilfried Zaha. He was Unai Emery's top target. It was much earlier in the window, and Steve Parish put a 100+ million price tag on his head. He didn't achieve it. Arsenal went for Nicola Pepe. Wilfried Zaha stayed. I think every summer he told Crystal Palace he wanted to leave. He didn't sign new contracts, or if he did, it was just to protect his value. In the end, he did fantastically for Crystal Palace, but he left as a free agent. They didn't recoup anything for him. They may say that was value because he was crucial in keeping them in the Premier League and all the riches and prestige that comes with it. But these are huge decisions, and I don't think the outcome is fully clear on Guéhi just yet.
Yeah. Are you surprised, David? You've been doing this for a while now, that Newcastle have been pretty quiet in the transfer window. I mean, we look at the sort of back end of last season, Elliot Anderson, Minter leaving to sort of fill that PSR black holes we spoke about earlier on in the podcast. But other than that, it's been really quiet for Newcastle this window.
One thing we got to appreciate is this: the richest club in world football on paper does not correlate to the reality of what they're allowed to do under the financial restrictions. They've been through a period of vast change with their sporting director, Dan Ashworth, leaving, going on gardening leave, and then joining Manchester United, a process to replace him that finally settled upon Paul Mitchell. So they're going to have to gel as a unit in terms of Paul Mitchell, in terms of Eddie Howe, the recruitment staff when it comes to Steve Nixon and Andy Howe and others in that mix. And I'm sure they're working already in a healthy way and trying to progress the club, but that takes time. Paul Mitchell wasn't the sporting director coming into this window. Of course, most clubs have plans for 12 months when it comes to recruitment. It's a similar situation, and I've got sympathy for it at Liverpool with Richard Hughes. He didn't come in until the months leading up to the market. He had to find a new head coach to replace Jurgen Klopp. He then had to embark upon the transfer window and contract renewals or situations to do with that. And then everybody's baying for signings. So there are lots of factors that limit what Newcastle have been able to do so far. There was the PSR issue that they finally got through with some quite remarkable scenes building up to June the 30th, involving players potentially and actually coming and going. The Anthony Gordon drama, Minte, Anderson, and so on. And that would have been a tumultuous period for not just them, but many other clubs in the Premier League. They come through that, and now they will have their plans. From what I understand, they would like to recruit a winger if possible, but they need to see what's going to happen on the outcome of the Guéhi situation for their finances. They do want to keep hold of all of their top players, and they are adamant that they will. So we're talking Alexander Isak, Bruno Guimaraes, Anthony Gordon, of course, and let's see if those players, if they do stay, end up signing new contracts, and Newcastle try to build organically and proactively into the future to try to bring this project together. I don't know of much more incoming business planned. You never know. We didn't see the young striker Osula from Sheffield United arriving. That sort of came out of the blue. And then there will be some exits as well. But you sense it will be more fringe players, the Ryan Frasers of this world, as opposed to sort of frontline players, because a lot of this with Newcastle now is the optics, the impression they send out to their supporters and to the game. If they're letting their big players leave, then what does that say about where they're going? I think it's a period of consolidation, a get to know you as the new regime takes shape, trying to keep players fit in a way that they didn't last season, get players like Sven Botman back to fitness, be prudent in the market, improve the way they're working, and try to continue what was an upward trajectory under the new ownership. Of course, they then fell out of the Champions League, and they want to get things moving again. Don't forget, there was the tumult in the summer around the England position. Gareth Southgate leaving. Is Eddie Howe the favourite? Eddie Howe coming out and speaking. A lot is going on at that club, and they'll want to just settle down, and I bet they can't wait to get the actual football underway.
Very much Newcastle. Just the season starting on Saturday feels important for that reason, because there's been so much noise and so much happening really this summer. But actually, in the market, Newcastle going into this summer, and also since Paul Mitchell have come in, the big message has been that the business they do want to do is to materially improve the first 11. And as things stand, you can't say they've done that. Of the players they've brought in, the only one who's likely to feature regularly in the actual starting 11 in the short term is in defence, where you've got Lloyd Kelly. He will probably play as a left-sided centre-back or a left-back, maybe away from home. But the two positions which really haven't been strengthened post-takeover in all that time have been, it's right-sided centre-back, where they've still got Fabian Schär, who's 32 years of age and has done extremely well, but has continuously been there. And also at right winger, where Jacob Murphy has performed well at the moment, but Miguel Almiron has done well there in recent years. Newcastle want to sign quality players who will go into the starting 11 and therefore raise the entire quality of the squad. Now, that is difficult. But like Michael Olise at Crystal Palace, another Crystal Palace player they looked at. And so they're going for the very, very sort of top level players they can. And then maybe either having to settle for slightly below that or just accepting they can't get someone for now. And so they are operating in a very difficult market. But I think that if they could get Marc Guehi over the line, if they could bring in a signing of that ilk, someone who would go into the side, could play in a few different positions, and clearly will materially strengthen them in a centre-back position where, because Sven Botman is injured, also Jamal Lascelles, the club captain, is out with an ACL injury. Newcastle have two 32-year-olds playing likely to start at centre-back this weekend, and Dan Burn and Fabian Schär have been very good for them, but actually they need greater depth there. Emil Kraft, a right-back, has been filling in as right-sided centre-back at periods because they just don't quite have the depth. And they tried to get Tosin Adarabioyo earlier in the summer. That was before they got Lloyd Kelly on a free transfer. They missed out on him to Chelsea. And instead, they've gone and they're trying to get a very, very ambitious signing in Marc Guehi. They haven't got him as things stand. The optics of that dragging on, and given what's happened this summer, are not ideal. But if they do get it over the line, I think the perception of this summer could change quite dramatically.
I still wonder, though, if Newcastle will be quite happy with where they are, quietly happy, not delighted. And I think you're right, Guéhi probably finishes things off nicely for them. And the only reason I say that is because it felt like complete panic stations at Newcastle at the end of June because of PSR and because of... I mean, I read the interview that was done with Longstaff, where he was saying, look, it felt like everybody was for sale, literally everybody. They needed to keep Guimaraes, who they have. They needed to keep Alexander Isak, and they have. They've obviously got Tonali coming back from this betting ban as well, which should make a big difference. Although I do think with Tonali, he's been out for a really long period, and it's hard to imagine that there hasn't been some kind of, without wanting to downplay what he was banned for, there must have been some emotional impact of this, and you wonder how that will affect his confidence and the ability to make an immediate impression when he returns. But it feels to me like Newcastle are actually pretty well set for the season, and given where they were at the end of June and how tense it seemed to be up there, I don't think that was necessarily guaranteed. Fourth place looks wide open to me this season, and while I wouldn't put money on Newcastle getting there, I think they're in the hunt.
Well, he returns on the 28th of August, which is my birthday, so it's a double cause for celebration.
Absolutely.
And I think we need to I think we need to remind ourselves of just how important a signing that was for Newcastle United at the time, of AC Milan's captain, Italy international, one of the midfielders in that, whether it be number 6, number 8 bracket, that was being looked at by the biggest clubs in world football. And he's not the only one. You've got your Barellas, and at the time there were various others too. Newcastle managed to get a gem, and that must have hit them like a sledgehammer that they lost him for such reasons and for such a long period of time. The way he would have been planned for in terms of their team, their style of play, it was a mixed opening for him, but still he was fundamental. And now that time is gone, and they'll look to reintegrate him like a new signing. Sorry for that corny phrase, but we're
going to hear it a lot this season, I feel like. Don't worry.
It really will be. And also, they were absolutely ravaged by injuries. I know a lot of clubs said it last season, but I can't think of many much more than Newcastle. Always, just when you thought they were through it and getting some players back, then you lost to Louis Miley to a bad injury. And he'll be coming back as well. And I mean, what a talent that boy is for club and country going forward. And when you see somebody like that, you start to think maybe you don't need to recruit in this position. They've got a lot of great potential. And on that injury point, Chris, is it James Bunce coming in to the club as well as head of performance? He's got a really good reputation, UK, USA, men's football, women's football. If he can help bring about a better situation in terms of fitness and availability, then bit by bit, Newcastle will be in the shape that Phil outlines, which is not too bad at all.
Okay, fantastic, David. I know you've got to go, but we'll be keeping an eye on the transfer deal sheet as well as you update that as this period gets so busy for you. So thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks, guys.
All right, let's move to the future and actually let's look to the season ahead. In fact, Chris, another aspect over the summer, especially where it concerns Newcastle, was obviously Gareth Southgate stepped down as the England manager and Eddie Howe immediately everyone jumped on it. Are you going to be the next manager for England or the next coach for England? How did Eddie Howe take that?
Well, this was back to Germany and being in that room where I'm sat on the medicine ball, and actually it was a bit when Howe arrived to do that interview, you could see he was tense beforehand, and his first answer was always going to be asked about England, and his first answer was almost an attempt to sort of shut down the questions, to move it beyond that, and. For the quite a lot of the remainder of the conversation, part of the reason why I think his quotes became so strong on the situation at Newcastle was it was almost lost in translation that a lot of the questions coming his way were England focused, and a lot of his responses was he was almost trying to shut down the England situation and talk about, no, I'm focused on what's happening in Newcastle right now and the situation I am in here. And very much from what he said publicly and what I understand about the situation is behind the scenes is that he's flattered by the England interest, but that's not where his focus is right now. He has been at Newcastle, he's set roots here, he's brought his family up. He's obviously achieved a heck of a lot in a short period of time, and he wants to achieve more. He wants to be that manager who breaks the 55-year and counting trophy drought. He wants to take them back to the Champions League on a regular basis, but he said he would only do that if he was, quote unquote, happy in the way that he works. And so I think he almost used the England job as a sort of bridge to be able to then talk about the situation at Newcastle, and he was almost getting frustrated that the England job kept coming his way because he hasn't been offered it. He hadn't been offered at that stage. He still hasn't been, and I didn't see it in the way that some others did, maybe, which was almost like a come get me play to England. I think it was almost more like, well, England may as well hold off for a bit, and you could put Lee Carsley in charge because we'll see in 3 months' time whether things have worked out in Newcastle, and then if he was to leave Newcastle for whatever reason in the course of the next few months, then what an opportunity that may be for England to try and get him. But yes, I think he's flattered as any Englishman would be, but I think his focus right now is very much on trying to find a way to make the relationship work at Newcastle so he can achieve what he wants to with a club he has given so much to already.
Do you think, though, Chris, that privately he wants the job, and do you think privately he's going to get an offer from the FA? There's definitely got to be a fairly strong possibility that Lee Carsley does fine in the games that come up because England usually end up playing, inferior international teams in a lot of the matches, so the results go well. Plus, combined with that, England under 21s have been really good under Carsley and have played well. So the possibility that the job just, it's just a straight transition from Southgate to Carsley has definitely got to be there. But if they do go for somebody else, and particularly now that Pochettino, it looks like he's going to the USMNT, then I think Eddie Howe will come into the conversation. So away from what he's saying publicly, do you think actually he's desperate deep down for this to go his way?
I don't think that he is, but at the same time, I say that with him having, as of yet, not been offered the job. I think if you're offered the job, I think it's a very, very different mindset, and it's very easy for you to have that and give that impression out that you wouldn't at the moment. You haven't actually been approached. So but if the FA came and could he say no to them? He suggested in Germany that yes, I could, but it's very, very different if that situation arises. What I think people overlook sometimes is people say, oh yeah, but if you didn't take it now, it might come around in 4 years' time. It doesn't really work like that. Certainly with the England job, you don't know that it's going to be there. Someone else could come in and could do really well, could be there for 8 years or however long it was, like Gareth Southgate. And then by that stage, Eddie Howe's stock could have fallen significantly. It could have risen significantly. He could have achieved a lot with Newcastle. He could have gone to another club side. So I don't think it is inevitable that if he said no at this point, it would come up again. But until he's put into that position, until an offer does arrive, if it indeed does, I think that he is actually being genuine to a large degree, and that his focus is on Newcastle because he hasn't actually got to make that clear decision right now.
Yeah, Phil, on that point, how difficult is it to turn that England job down, right? Chris talks about not having a trophy at Newcastle for 55 years. I mean, the England job since 1966 for the men's team, to get that trophy, it's a high profile job, surely.
But the club game still seems to override international football, doesn't it? And I often think that question depends on who you are and the stage of your career that you're at. I mean, to go back to Pochettino quickly, I don't think Pochettino coming out of Tottenham is interested in moving into international football. I think it's still the club game for him. And I think Eddie Howe will have the ambition to coach England in the way that everybody has the ambition to coach England. But I think if you were dangling in front of him that, and also the possibility that in a year's time, a couple of years' time, he might be looking at one of the biggest, club jobs in the game. And I find that hard to imagine happening, to be honest. I do really rate Howe, but I'm not convinced he's going to ever jump to that bracket, but we'll see. But if the choice is there, then I think at his age and the stage of his coaching career, the club game's still going to be the pool as far as I can see. I suspect with this that if the FA do decide to go for him, it's going to very much depend on how he feels about the setup at Newcastle. I think Chris made this point, really. How does it feel for him? Is it going well? Does he think that it's got legs? And if it does, then I think the temptation to stick at Newcastle will definitely be pretty strong. But to my mind, he still seems like he's got plenty to offer to the club game. And that tends to be the bread and butter for managers.
Yeah, Phil, I mean, you mentioned Pochettino earlier, and it's big news in the US, which is leading on the newsletter. Mauricio Pochettino is the new coach of the USA men's national team. What are the details of that, Phil?
Well, I'm wary of talking about this as if it's official, because it isn't as things stand, but it is agreed and it is in the process of being finalised. And I think unless there's a spanner in the works, this will happen. It's a huge appointment for USMNT. It's also a really, really big leap forward from Greg Berhalter, who was the coach previously and sacked after the Copa America. And it's the end of the sort of review process that took place after that tournament, which had to take place because it was a real flop for the US. And I think on the back of it, there was very little chance that Berhalter was going to survive. In simple terms, US soccer can't afford for the performance at the 2026 World Cup, which is essentially a home World Cup for them and will have a lot of eyes on it. They can't afford for the performance to be that poor and that underwhelming. You'll have seen Jurgen Klopp linked with the job earlier in the summer, quite tentatively, and that never felt particularly realistic. It was almost like aiming too high. But Pochettino, I think the timing is right for him, and it is a case of aiming for the stars. I think the US, they've been bold with this. And they said that money would be no obstacle to an appointment. It clearly hasn't been, given that it is Pochettino. And I think what you'll get with him, it's not to say that this is going to work, but what you're going to get with him is a really clear tactical plan. I think he will work the players hard. And that, I saw a few people quoted as questioning whether or not it was a little bit too cosy under the previous regime. It's going to be very, very interesting to follow. They've got a friendly against Canada coming up in September. I imagine that will be absolutely packed out. If you're US soccer at the moment and you can get this over the line, I think you'll be very, very happy.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Jesse March versus Pochettino. This is going to be definitely a good matchup in the friendly, right?
For sure.
Right, thanks for that, Phil. Let's get the take from the States right now. Here's the Athletic senior reporter, Paul Tenorio.
Hey guys, Paul Tenorio here with a bit of an immediate reaction from the United States on news that Mauricio Pochettino has agreed to become the next U.S. men's national team coach. Obviously, some steps still to be taken to finalize the deal and confirm everything, but really a lot of excitement here in the United States around this news. This is a major, major statement from U.S. soccer to hire a coach with the pedigree of Mauricio Pochettino, and I think it was a necessary change from a coach like Greg Berhalter. Now with Pochettino here, this is a coach who's coached some of the biggest clubs in the world. What U.S. soccer knew they needed was a coach with a high profile. They couldn't have a coach coming from Major League Soccer again. I think they needed somebody that could say, listen, we have huge ambitions around a home World Cup. We believe that this group is capable of going deeper in a World Cup than any before it. And we're going to hire a coach that shows that we have that level of ambition. Mauricio Pochettino certainly fills that role. The question now is, what should expectations be around this team? There's a lot of hope around this group of players, a lot of belief that they have more potential than any group in U.S. soccer history before it. And the question is regarding, whether they can turn that potential into results. And there should be some concern around it, right? It depends on where these young players go in their club careers. And there are a lot of question marks right now around guys like Weston McKennie and Tyler Adams, Gio Reyna, whether it's via injury or what club they're going to play for. Have they been improving? Have they been getting better? But still, the potential is there for this team to do something special. Now they have a coach that, I think only ups those expectations. And I think it also turns a bit of attention to the players themselves. There have been a lot of fans who have talked about this as a golden generation. Okay, now it's going to be up to the players to perform. U.S. Soccer has gone out. They've gotten the best coach possible that they could get. And they're saying, look, we are giving you the tools now to go and be successful at the World Cup in 2026. Can this squad live up to those expectations? That's a big part of this question. But I think overall, a home run hire for U.S. Soccer. Mauricio Pochettino, the exact type of profile that U.S. Soccer had been looking for going into this coaching search. And I think it gives the fans around the U.S. a lot of excitement, even more excitement around this men's national team.
Right, Chris, let's park that for the time being, because look, there's Premier League starting this weekend. Southampton at home and also Bournemouth away after that. You'd expect with those two fixtures, and I guess there's some sentimental aspects with Bournemouth for Eddie Howe. You'd expect Newcastle to start those first two games quite strongly.
Yeah, Newcastle actually, relative certainly to last year, have what looks to be a kind on paper start to the season. And for all of they have mentioned that Newcastle haven't materially strengthened the starting 11 in the transfer market, and that actually, if you look at the starting 11 that will start on Saturday, is likely to start on Saturday relative to the one that started against Aston Villa a year ago, it looks slightly weaker. But actually, because Newcastle spent so much of last season with so many players injured, and they have a lot of those back, and they're going to have Sandro Tonali back within a fortnight, suddenly you actually look at it and you can see Newcastle being successful this season. They don't have Champions League football and the damage that did in terms of physically to them, both in terms of fitness levels and the injuries that it caused. Newcastle want to be in the Champions League, but actually it was the season before, when they didn't have European football, that they both reached the final of the Carabao Cup and they managed to qualify for the Champions League. So that, without having that quote-unquote distraction, that is something which I think will really benefit them. And if they could start the season well, as they did 2 years ago, and build a momentum, Eddie Howe's sides are very, very momentum-based. He wants to be back to that high-intensity, high-pressing side you saw a couple of years ago. It's far easier to do that if you've only got one game a week for the majority of the season. And I do think that Newcastle will be really pushing towards that sort of top 4-5 positions this season.
Okay, fantastic, Chris. Let's leave it there. And so excited to see how Newcastle start this season with everything that's happened over the summer. Thanks so much for joining us. And do remember, you can get more from Chris over on Pod on the Tyne as well. Appreciate your time. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.